This week on Inside Olympia, why is student performance stagnating? What do Trump administration policies mean for Washington schools? How did schools fare in the recent state budget? On the program to talk about those issues and much more is State School Superintendent Chris Reykdal.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
Welcome to Inside Olympia. Washington's public education system faces stresses and challenges even in this post-COVID era. There are signs of declining or stagnating student performance. New Trump administration policies are in conflict with Washington state laws. Lawmakers have removed the cap on special education funding, but there's still not enough money to meet all needs. And the state's fiscal crisis is putting new pressure on local levies. Joining me now, and for the full hour to talk about the state of public education in Washington, is State Schools Superintendent Chris Reykdal. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
We have a lot to talk about since you were last here. Let's start with the federal climate. You've been in the news a lot because, in essence, you were taking on the Trump administration on some pretty significant topics. DEI policies, transgender policies, and then on top of that, there's concern about federal education cuts coming. And oh, by the way, the Federal Department of Education might not exist for that much longer. So big picture, and we'll take each of those as pieces, but big picture, in your tenure, how are you sizing up this moment in time, especially as it relates to state level education and your relationship with a federal administration?
Big picture, I'd say 90% of Washingtonians and almost 90% of people around the country went to public ed, and I've never seen it more under attack by a federal administration. So it's something to be taken very seriously. There's a legitimate debate on a lot of these issues. We'll get into each of them, but I don't think we've ever had a moment where people debated whether public ed is the most powerful thing we've underwritten in terms of our economy. It produces 90% of our workers and 80% of our college enrollments, and it's so important to us as a democracy, as an economy, as quite frankly a care facility, so two income families can work. It's really foundational. So it's pretty threatening. It's real. It's not just words. Maybe the first Trump administration had a lot of rhetoric around it. They're trying to use executive orders now to dismantle and privatize the system, and we all have to be ready for that.
So as you think about orders of priority or magnitude or the biggest threats as you see them right now, what is at the top of your list?
Civil rights protections. There's a lot of debate around whether there should be a U.S. Department of Ed and how big it should be, and I have my own concerns with it. I'll be candid with you. I've resisted it when it was under the Obama leadership at times. What I've never doubted, though, is its purpose. It originally formed in 1979, 1980 because all of this federal civil rights laws came about. The Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65. You've got federal laws to protect students with disabilities. So the department was created fundamentally as a civil rights organization. So if they want to cut discretionary programs and grants or send more money to the states, like I've said, let's have a good conversation about that. My colleagues around the country in my role, we're ready to have that. But if it's about taking away protections for kids, that's a problem because there is nobody else. And I know they say, well, we'll give some of it to Department of Justice and we'll give others to that's not how it works. When you have that much complex legal framework to protect kids, you don't want to talk to 6 different federal agencies. You want to talk to one.
So in some respects, you see the Federal Department of Education as a bureaucratic morass, but you also see it as an important kind of line of demarcation or defense when it comes to the civil rights of students because it has the mechanism, the ability to investigate alleged violations.
I don't see them as a bureaucratic morass, so I'd put it this way. Yes, on the civil rights part. Like, they are the backstop for civil rights protections. And they do direct investigations into states and districts, and they backstop us when we find civil rights violations, or at least until this administration. So that's important. What I've seen them do, though, is listen to Congress and get bigger. They want grant programs, and they want to target new ideas. It's okay. Congress gets the choice to do this. But if there's a place they can pare back, it's sort of all of the nickel and dime ideas of members of Congress who think they're going to solve it.
So maybe not crisis. Morass, maybe bloat's the word.
Too big for real impact. Protect civil rights, send the money to the states, hold us accountable, but don't try to run programs out of the federal government that really hit classrooms.
So just to be very clear, what is your position, your view of this proposal from the president to actually abolish the Federal Department of Education?
He should not do it. I don't think Congress will give him the votes to do it. It has an important role do lean it down to civil rights and innovation, but stop running programs out of the federal government that are meant to impact classrooms. They are too far away from the actual classroom.
What about threats to federal education dollars that flow to Washington State for any number of things, including school meals, special education, Title I high poverty schools? What are you hearing and what are you anticipating? What are you worried about in terms of federal cuts, especially as Congress right now is debating spending bills?
Three things. We see the department pulling back where they actually have discretion. So there was discretionary money at the Department of Agriculture, ironically, not Ed, on money states were using to buy local food products. So we were going to local farmers and buying berries and buying vegetables.
Trying to source locally.
Yeah, source locally and really help in the community. That kind of stuff has been cut. So where they've had discretion, they've done it. The second thing they want to do is use executive orders to force cuts, or what they call dear colleague letters, where they don't have authority. The courts have mostly stopped them on all of that stuff. Most presidential executive orders that attempt to make permanent law change never work, no matter the party. But the third and bigger risk is that Congress will finally sit down, as we saw in the news in the last couple of days, to sit down and actually write a full congressional budget, finally actually look at our federal budget. Everything we hear is that there's going to be cuts to programs and education, and maybe not high poverty, maybe not meals or support for students with disabilities, but that's 3/4 of the money we get from the feds. The other quarter funds a lot of other stuff, and we're hearing all that other stuff is very much at risk.
Just to give us a baseline here, how much of the state education budget is funded by the federal government, and how does that sort of vary district to district?
Yeah, so in our state, it's perhaps $1.2, $1.3 billion. It's about 7% of our total education spending, so we are much less dependent than the rest of the country because we have a great education system, because we have a good economy. Most of the programs don't spend as much money in our state per kid as they do, say, all over the South where there's much higher poverty. So 7%'s a lot, and I say that because it's on average it seems reasonable, but in some districts it's 20, 30, 40% if they're the combination of high poverty and rural, and they get federal assistance because they're adjacent to federal lands like military bases. So for some of our communities it's a lot of money. So that if they cut a lot here, it'll be very disproportionate around the state. It is not as if everyone will take a 7% cut. You will see very big cuts in some areas, mostly rural conservative areas, ironically, whereas our urban areas are less dependent.
So is there a plan in place to try to backfill if that happens? I know it's hard to prepare in advance when you don't know it's going to happen, but what kind of conversations have you had with legislators and perhaps the governor?
Well, very limited because they just got through their own budget reduction cycle. They mostly protected our districts, but took a huge toll on state organizations, state agencies, and others. So I don't think they're in the mood to backfill $1.3 billion or even $300 or $400 million. What we're trying to do is keep our lawmakers up to speed on what are the biggest risk areas? Where are you likely to hear that pressure? And I think a migrant bilingual, right? We want to support our immigrant families. We get huge return as students learn English proficiently, as they engage in STEM activities. I just met with a group of students who are migrant youth and when they were younger, and they're just doing awesome now. So that's the kind of thing I think lawmakers would say, ooh, if those federal dollars go away, what could we do? But it's too early to tell. They've got their own budget challenges here in Olympia. I think November, December, January, they're going to have a much better visibility on what they might be able to do to backfill federal cuts. And we're small, remember, compared to Medicaid,
Right.
The Human Services side, those are enormous reductions potentially.
Sticking with the Trump administration and the federal government, you have publicly challenged the administration's threats to cut education funding over diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. You've affirmed what you say is Washington's constitutional right to shape its own education system, saying Washington will not suppress its core values. What is your legal and what's your moral case for defying this Trump order around DEI? And maybe more importantly, how far are you willing to go with this?
Well, I'm willing to go the distance because that's my job as the state superintendent, elected by the people. I'm the superintendent of public instruction, so public ed. We have an amazing attorney general who will make decisions along the way on how to push and where to push, and so I yield to Attorney General Brown, who's doing great work. The legal case is pretty simple. You start with the 10th Amendment. If it isn't explicitly enumerated for Congress or the federal government, it's the states. And most of education falls in that category. Certainly things like curriculum and teaching standards and evaluation and teacher evaluation. So there's no doubt that legally they're overstepping their boundaries at this point. There's a pretty good argument coming from some plaintiffs around First Amendment. So who's to tell a teacher you can't teach a certain perspective? Mm-hmm. And again, we have really clear learning standards, so we don't let folks go way left or way right here. They've got curriculum they follow in their district. They've got expectations that they have to meet. So we're talking about the history you and I learned, teaching people about the civil rights movement and talking about the fact that, just because we fought a civil war and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment passed, it wasn't all hunky-dory the next day. It was decades and decades of states then taking on oppressive actions. That's just history. I think this administration would say that's DEI. We're supposed to, lift up the flag and praise America every day. And I think there's room to be a proud American and talk about our honest history. And we're not going to back away from that. And that's really what's at stake here. And we see it in states like Texas, where their state board of ed has grabbed curriculum and told districts what they can and can't teach. They've scrubbed textbooks. That's really dangerous, and we're not going to do that here. So that's the legal argument. The moral argument, of course, is we're just better off when we do this. When students feel included, when our history is authentic, when we honestly face our history, we're much less likely to repeat it. So I think it's not hard to go the route that I'm going. It's just going to take some time, and quite frankly, the Trump administration will have to figure out if they want to poke a state in the Northwest in the eye over a few $100 million over a bad legal case, or they want to actually hunker down and improve education.
So what would the potential penalty be here? You are, in essence, defying a presidential order. What could happen? What could the penalty be? Can they take money from the state? Would they have to take you to court? How does this potentially play out?
The process is supposed to work that they find some kind of violation. Maybe it's Title IX, maybe it's Title VI, something. They investigate. They're supposed to do that. Mm-hmm. They say they're going to. They still haven't called us. They still haven't asked for documents. Then they're supposed to conclude with a finding, and then we challenge that finding with due process. We say, here's where we disagree. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, if this doesn't come to a head, undoubtedly they'll claim they want to take money from us. They've tried in other states and have been stopped, but they'll claim they want to take money, and then it'll be up to our Attorney General to decide how to defend our state.
The state is under investigation, as I understand it, for its gender inclusion guidance, having to do with transgender participation in sports. What is the status of, first off, why don't you explain sort of the position you've taken here as well, and then we'll sort of talk about what the status is with the federal government.
Yeah, so our state laws have been in place for, years and years, and then our athletic association, which is actually not a state agency. So the Washington Intercollegiate Athletic Association, WIAA, it's not part of my office. It's an independent organization that runs. They, for almost 15 years, or maybe more than 15 years, have had an inclusionary policy for transgender youth, and it's gone, quite frankly, very well, because it's about engaging parents and it's about schools understanding and then accommodating them with private spaces and all of that. And it isn't until this administration came and made it a national issue that suddenly people think there's a crisis, and they have this false sense that kids are in the wrong locker rooms, which just does not happen. So that's the setup here, is that we've had a state for a decade and a half doing this really well. Other states have modeled us. It's gone quite effectively. There's a lot of trans youth. There are very few who actually participate in athletics. And now suddenly it's a big issue. So they're after us as a state. They're after my office for enforcing the law. And like we described earlier, it's supposed to be a process where they investigate, grab documentation, make a finding, we get to appeal. They have yet to actually engage us. So we have no idea what they're considering an investigation. We heard in Maine, when they took that state on in the same way, they concluded it in 3 or 4 days, and Maine said, you didn't even ask for our legal documentation, there was no engagement, and they said, well, we talked to some of your local news outlets and got everything we needed. If that's the way it's going to go, the Trump administration's in for a tough go, because that's not authentic and it's not good due process, and we'll defeat them.
Do you anticipate ending up in court over this?
I keep saying that's probably where it goes, because I'm not sure they're interested in the facts that our state gets to write civil rights laws. They're not interested in the fact that we've been doing it for a decade and a half, that we have the legal right. I think they want to fight over this. We don't. We didn't initiate this. I think they want a national fight over this issue because it's good politics for them by demonizing and vilifying, a very small percentage of our kids who we think need protection. So, yeah, it's probably going to end up in court.
The La Center district has been in the news lately, the Tumwater district. There is, I mean, as you say, this has become an issue, and it's become kind of a cultural touch, a kind of culture war issue. It's become an issue that seems to be galvanizing some voters, and it's certainly an issue where you see a red-blue state divide. What is one of the arguments, recurring arguments about transgender girls in girls' sports is that it is a Title IX violation, that it's unfair to the biological females on those teams. What is your position in view of this?
Well, our position is that the federal law doesn't describe Title IX beyond the words that are there, sex. They don't say biological sex or sex at birth. And so the states for decades have had a chance to interpret that the way that it fits each state. Oklahoma is going to think about it differently than Washington. So we've said that your gender identity, how you identify, is the way to proceed because there are, legitimately transgender youth by identity. There are transgender folks by biology. This is the part that's frustrated people, and they come at me and attack me pretty good. We have intersex births. There's a percentage of our population where you are not born one way or the other. There is transgender identity based on hormonal balances. Like, this is a biological issue for nearly all of these kids. So that alone should make us pause and sort of think twice about this. You hear arguments of safety, and what I say to them is this is so rare that I wonder why folks aren't questioning the 250-pound senior linebacker who gets to dismantle the 110-pound freshman, wide receiver or running back. Like, we don't even think about safety when it's male on male, female on female, or trans. That's the moment we think about it. If we're talking safety, let's really talk about safety, because other than that, the arguments of taking away something from females hasn't borne out, but I understand politically why that's hard for people. If you're not aware of the biology, if you're not aware of that, you don't have family, you don't live with that reality. But look at what we've done in our history. I mean, we told left-handed kids they were wrong and coached them out of it for 100 years. We banned interracial marriages on questions of science. There's some horrific things in our past that are starting to creep up here. And I would say to everybody, take a deep breath. We have really good laws about this that protect all kids and all privacy, and we still allow participation. And if you don't like any of the rest of that, you should never let your federal government run in and tell you exactly how to run your state when they weren't clear in the federal law what is and isn't.
Let me step back. You are, in essence, defying the Trump administration on some of these issues. At the same time, let's go back to the La Center district, which your agency is now investigating because they, from your point of view, did not adhere to Washington civil rights law, specifically around whether to identify transgender students by their preferred pronouns, and also having to do with, notifying parents. So you're kind of in the middle here, right? You're looking up at the Trump administration and saying, actually, I don't think that we're going to comply, and I think it's in conflict with Washington law, and you are being investigated as a result, or OSPI is. At the same time, you're in a position to investigate districts and have taken that step rather than let them set their own policies at a local level. Help us untangle that. Why not let La Center do what La Center's going to do, and Tumwater do what it's going to do, and sort of go the local control route?
Because there's a limit to that. So education law in this country has a very small role for the federal government. Whether you look at the U.S. Constitution or U.S. law, it is very much preserved for the states, and that means something in both federal and state law. State education agencies get to determine that. Some states give all of that control then away to locals and say, do what you kind of want to do. Our state takes kind of a middle-of-the-road approach where we have a lot of local control on how they spend their money and who they hire and their bill schedules and their boundaries and all of that. But when it comes to our civil rights law, we apply a common standard across our districts. We do not allow districts to interpret civil rights law one district at a time. So we hear this from folks, like, it's local control, we get to do what we want. You got to do it within the law, though. And in this case, the controlling legislation is state law, which allows for gender identity. So that's why we do find ourselves caught in, like, federal government, you're not actually legally in this space. Into our local districts, we say, here's the 90% of places you have local control and flexibility. This is not one of the places, because if a conservative community interprets civil rights differently than a progressive community, you have two students who are treated totally disproportionately with the exact same status, and including protected status. which our legislature just passed another bill to double down on the fact that this state
Right.
protects kids uniquely. So it's a matter of law, not Chris's personal opinion. Any superintendent in this role would interpret it the same way, I believe, because they get legal counsel from the AG. Gosh, I just keep telling our districts, follow the law. Let us figure out what the feds are going to do. It'll probably end up in court. And in the case of, identifying students, follow the law.
I hear what you're saying. I also think it's interesting that you're in this position of, on the one hand, defying federal orders, and on the other hand, enforcing what you believe is state laws that applies to the districts. How can you have it both ways? Or I could imagine some of these districts saying, who's this guy to tell us what to do? Because he's looking upstream at the federal
The
government and
difference
saying
is
no.
it's not both ways. When I say follow the law, I mean follow the law. Local districts have to follow state law, and the federal government should follow the law. They have no jurisdiction in this. The president's executive orders are political ambitions most of the time. He doesn't get to change federal law. He doesn't get to change federal code. He doesn't get to do that. That's why the courts constantly throw it out. So it's the same position to everybody. Everybody follow the law. And when you do that, you realize that locals have to follow state law, and the federal government has to defer to the state on most issues. And when you harmonize that, what you realize is our legislature has the control here, as does 49 other legislatures. They are the authority on the issues that aren't clearly the federal government's, but are in the education space. Follow the law.
And again, when it comes to the sports environment, how much of that is district decision? How much of that is state? How much is WIAA?
Well, when it comes to the civil rights side of it, so who gets to participate, particularly around gender, that's state law, and then ultimately my office has to interpret that, as does WIAA. As a nonprofit in the state, they have to follow the law. That's why they've done what they've done. So they didn't come up with this on their own. They are trying to follow law that goes back, like I said, more than a decade, and they've had this framework in place, I think, for 15 years. So it's really about legislatures around the country. That's really the locus of control here. My job's to carry out the law. I'm on the executive branch, and for WIA, they don't invent this stuff. They're just trying to carry out the law.
On the issue of students who are from immigrant families and communities, there has been some criticism of you that more than defiance is needed, that there needs to be a more proactive response to an environment where families are worried about ICE coming in the middle of the day and taking parents away from kids, where there's just general anxiety and concern about whether it's safe to go to school and whether families will be left intact or separated. What, in light of the Trump administration's immigration policies and in light of some of the on-the-ground criticism that school districts and OSPI could and should be doing more, what do you say?
Well, again, it's a question of law, and in the case of immigration enforcement, that's clearly a federal issue, right? So the hard news I keep breaking to people is we put up all of the legal protections that we can, but at the end of the day, federal immigration law drives practice. We don't have state immigration officers. We don't have counter operations. So what we've done is guide schools as clearly as we can on here's how you protect kids personally at school. We don't allow anyone to come onto our campuses without identification. So you can't just come on and say, I want to see a student. You can detain, that's a terrible word, you can hold that law enforcement officer in place and say, I need to see your court order or something that looks like a federal order. You can even say, not right now, because we're going to contact parents. We're going to make sure parents and guardians are involved here. So there's a lot districts can do to protect kids, and thankfully, ICE has not used schools for detaining individuals at this point in time. So we think we've done everything, again, within the law. But, the sad news here is we have to tell folks, the federal government does have a right to do this work. I don't personally like the way they're going about it, but they have so far not violated a long-standing practice of not using our schools to detain kids, which is great. Now, Trump's unwound that. He said he may. Prior administrations, Republican and Democrat, have said we won't. He said we may. They just haven't done it yet. So, again, we're back to this question of the law, and in this case, the federal government has a lot of authority here. We just want them to operate the way they have, which is, if this is an adult issue, treat it as an adult issue and do not harm kids along the way.
We started out talking about potential federal budget cuts. And you referenced the fact the state legislature has just adjourned and passed a budget in trying budget times. What would you say about how this budget treats public education? I will note that Governor Ferguson had said he wants a greater percentage of state spending to go to education because that had slipped from sort of a high water mark of about 50% after the last McCleary payment was made. And I think it dropped down to something like 44% or maybe 45. You will correct me if I'm wrong. But on the whole, and then we'll talk some details, on the whole, how does this budget look for K-12 education?
Well, I'm going to be careful here because I'm a biased individual.
And a recovering lawmaker.
Yeah, and former classroom teacher and school board member and now superintendent. So I have an appetite for education.
I mean, you wanted $3 billion.
We wanted $3 billion additional dollars over the biennium to
additional.
address 3 core areas, and we got perhaps a third of that or so.
A third. So about a billion plus.
Yeah, by the time special education and inflation and some other things kick in. So you asked a good question. I would say it was relatively neutral. Here's the way I believe that that's the case. We were about 52% after McCleary. So the court told our legislature you need to fund schools. The legislature did it for 2 years. They really grew K-12 disproportionately faster. They were catching up for decades of underfunding. We thought we'd hold that level for a while, and then immediately it began to shrink, and then through COVID it really shrank. We're down to 42.5%, 42.4% now of the budget. That's right where we were 10 years ago. So lots of people say, gosh, all this money's gone into K-12, and now that we run the budget against human services or natural resources or anything else, we're just there with everybody else for the last decade. We had a spike, but then we had a decline in our share. So if you're looking at it that way, K-12's fared just like everybody else. So we're back to the underlying question, should it have fared better? Should it fare better in the future? I am biased in believing that if you're pouring a bunch of money into human services and corrections and rehabilitative services and chemical dependency and all that, it's probably because you didn't put enough on the front end of the system. Starting with early learning, by the way, I'll put them ahead of K-12. That's where I'd like to see more energy. So this is an age-old debate. I think they had a difficult budget environment to deal with. They worked their tails off to try to get to a balanced budget that restores emergency reserves and keeps everybody as whole as possible. Our legislature did an awfully nice job not harming school districts and, in fact, added a little bit of money in some areas, which is nice. It is not the ample system that I think the courts had in mind.
Just before we go to break, do you think that the legislature is courting another lawsuit or inviting another lawsuit?
It's hard to say. We might have to pick it up after the break, Austin, because this is what the law says versus what everyone's feeling. And if you're in a school and you're in 35 student, 40 student classrooms, you know something isn't right. But the letter of the law from the court was the legislature gets to decide the funding formulas, and as long as they fund their formulas, they're okay. That's what they did. So we're not debating anymore whether or not the legislature stepped into the moment 6 years ago. The question is the framework that they're using today actually what's needed when it comes to mental health or student learning recovery? The court said you need to review this once in a while. It's time to review it.
We will take a quick break. When we return, we continue our interview with State School Superintendent Chris Reykdal. Back in a moment.
It will dwarf Katrina. It'll be absolutely the largest thing that we will have had to have dealt with in our country. We know the clock is ticking.
With only 15 minutes or so, that's not a lot of time to evacuate.
And welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again is State School Superintendent Chris Reykdal. And sticking with the budget, the state budget that is, there was a removal this year of the cap on special ed, which had sort of an artificial cap, I guess, saying essentially you can only have this percentage of students who are getting special ed services, and that's only what we'll pay up to. So the cap is gone, but the legislature did not appropriate enough money to cover all of the needs. So help us understand, from your perspective, how much of a win this was versus, half a loaf.
Well, I do think it was a win. Anytime you have this artificial line that says only 16% of your kids can have disabilities, but you're in a community where it's 17 or 18 or 19, then there shouldn't be a limit. The way the legislature used to deal with that is they'd give you money for 16%, and then they had this secondary system that said, well, if you're in crisis because there's a high cost accommodation or you've got a lot more students than the cap, then there's this other fund you can go after. They kind of got rid of that part. So now, as there's need, there's going to be funding. And they did actually fund that, which is great. I think the challenge, of course, is we then put that up against what districts are actually spending to support students with disabilities, and we continue to see a pretty large gap.
I mean, the number I have here is that while the cap goes away, that only a fraction of the estimated $600 million shortfall is actually funded. Is that the number you're
Yeah,
using?
that's right. So they pick up the additional students above 16%. They throw a little bit of money, what we call the multiplier. That's the extra money to support students. But then we compare it to what districts are actually spending, especially out of their local levy funds, and we see this gap. And so there's still hundreds of millions of dollars in a gap there. And I think lawmakers that I talk to are interested in continuing to make progress. So this has been a really cool bipartisan thing since I've been in this office. It's been a priority in every one of my requests. We've doubled the level of investment here. We're not probably where we should be yet, but you can't argue this isn't a state that's made enormous progress on the investment side. And again, it's very bipartisan, which is great.
So if eliminating the cap is sort of being celebrated as a moral victory, what is your thinking or proposal for trying to close the remaining funding gap then?
Yeah, I think we're right now at the heart of the issue, which is some of these accommodations just cost a lot more money than you're typically developing or typically performing peer. If you need 24-hour care and you're at school for 8 hours a day, that's a cost that has to get picked up. The state funds an average. They say, here's what the average kid needs, and that works for a lot of our students, but some students aren't average. No kid's average, and in this case, some need more. So I suspect there's room here for a high-cost accommodation model beyond what we call the safety net, maybe something bigger in that space that could probably do a lot to kind of close the final gap here.
The other thing that the legislature did is pass a law allowing students to stay, or young people to stay in special education up to age 22 as opposed to 21. I know I've talked to parents of youth with special needs who talk about kind of an education cliff. And oftentimes what ends up happening is their kids or young adults will go into like supported living, and there's really not much opportunity for them in the job market, and they're sitting in a house watching TV all day, and the parents just dread the day they lose education services. But this is only by one more year. So what's the significance of going from 21 to 22?
Well, there was a federal rule change. The federal government has a role in this. Again, IDEA, Individuals with Disability Education Act. So the federal government in the 1960s and 70s, through a series of laws, said you're going to take care of kids. They create this requirement. It's really important. They don't amply fund it, so the states do. They changed their rules, though, to say that it's basically through the last year, age 22 instead of 21. So this was about reconciling our state law, which still said 21, and federal expectations, which were 22. It ended up in court, and it's unfortunate it did, but that's sometimes what it takes. And we were caught in the middle of, like, do we follow state law, federal law? Thankfully, the legislature reconciled that. We're all on the same page now. But your point is bigger and more powerful, Austin. If you don't focus on transition services, it doesn't matter whether it's 18, 19, 21, 22. And this is what concerns me about state budget cuts, it concerns me around federal cuts that are potentially coming, is it's not enough to fund the student while they're getting direct services. There's got to be a plan. Our state did a great job years ago with the bill we put forward in my office to focus on high school and beyond plans. And it's a universal tool. We want every student to have a plan so we know what they're going to need in transition. It's now going to become a digital platform commonly used across the state. We're in the middle of that, which is the next step. We are trying to think about the responsibility of K-12 being more than just getting them across the graduation stage, but actually empowering them for their next step, no matter what that is. And our students with disabilities, many of them need much clearer transition services and a better handoff to systems that can support them once they leave us.
So sticking with the budget and the idea that there is a need beyond what the state funded, one of the things that majority Democrats did is pass a bill this year that allows more flexibility in local levies. And immediately there was pushback and criticism from Republicans in particular, saying that this is what got us into the McCleary straits in the first place, and that it advantages wealthier districts and disadvantages poorer districts. It's my understanding you supported this change. John Braun, the Senate Republican leader, said when discriminatory policies like this move forward, it's hard to take Democrats seriously when they claim to be prioritizing equity or considering the real impact of their legislation on low-income communities or people of color. How do you respond to the idea that this legislation, this local levy flexibility, exacerbates inequity and could trigger a second McCleary lawsuit?
Well, I respect Senator Braun a lot. He's very respected on the Hill. He cares deeply about this issue. He and I fundamentally disagree about this because he doesn't accept the way the law actually works, or the courts. Here's the analogy I give you. If you've been paid by somebody and they've shortchanged you $5 an hour for 10 years of your life, and you win a court case, great. But in the meantime, you couldn't feed your family, so you went out and got a second job. The second job is not the reason you were in trouble. It's because you weren't getting the resources that you needed. Once the court says, Austin, you're going to get all of your money from that employer, you can still keep the second job if you want to, if you're willing to work hard and, do more. That's what's happening here. Levies were never the reason we were in court. This is what I think Republicans and some Democrats get wrong, as they say, oh, we were too reliant on levies and therefore the court said this. No, the court said the legislature has funding formulas and they weren't funding their own formulas.
But don't the local levies let the state off the hook?
No, because the legal requirement for the state is to fund their formulas. So as long as they do that, levies can be half the size they are today. They can be 10 times bigger. They are for enrichment activities. So the subtlety here is don't blame a tool that a lot of communities have used for decades to have extra things they want for their kids. Focus on the gaps that the state isn't funding.
So what about the sort of have-not element to this, that wealthier districts can leverage this levy capacity and buy those extras that everybody would like to have, and poorer districts can't or don't?
Well, let's talk about the can't or don't. If they don't by political choice, that's a choice that they're making, and that's reality.
Remind us of what the vote is these days to
Yeah,
do
so you need a
this?
simple majority to pass a levy. So we're not talking about bonds, construction bonds, which require 60%. Simple majority to pass levies. We're passing 82% of them, by the way. 92% of the money that went to the ballot last year passed. Voters are very supportive of their schools. They're not passing in red districts because of this persistent sort of attack on public education, which is another conversation. But the point being that if you are willing to support your schools, even a minimal level, the state actually comes forward and gives you extra money if you're a property poor community. So that probably needs to be enhanced. This is where Senator Braun and I probably agree. The state has a mechanism, though, to make these more equal, but you still got to have your own skin in the game, because everyone has to put their share in for local. And remember, these are enrichment. These are to fund extra things. Seattle's the perfect example. Everyone said, why does Seattle have to make so many cuts? Why are they closing schools? Well, they're figuring it out, but part of the reason is for 4 decades, they were allowed to tax themselves. They chose to. Their voters get that look every 2 or 3 years. They've said, we're willing to tax ourselves to have more elementary schools closer in our neighborhoods that are smaller in size. That's not what the state funds. That's an enrichment. But our legislature forcibly cut those levies 7 years ago without asking the voters of Seattle. They just forcibly said, you cannot raise that money anymore. So there's a middle ground here where we focus together in a bipartisan way on funding the system. Special ed's a perfect example. But once the state fills up its bucket, the court did not say you have to lower levies. That was a political choice. And I've always said if a community wants to support their kids more, especially if they're socializing that cost, you should do that. Because otherwise only the wealthy families will get access to the sports and the extracurriculars. And where there's a community that is willing to help themselves but is so property poor they can't, that's why the state steps in with levy equalization. There is a
But
solution
my understanding
here.
is the levy equalization wasn't included
It was.
in this.
Yeah, in the end, $137 million more dollars are going to go to property poor communities, mostly rural communities, to help make up for the fact that Seattleites get the privilege of taxing themselves more.
Do you really believe that the reason levies are failing is because voters have been told their public schools are failing, or is it because people's pocketbooks are stretched thin and they look at this and say, I can't afford a property tax increase?
We're just looking at the numbers. 92% of all the levy dollars passed last year, and the only places they are not passing are in very conservative areas. It's not a criticism of individuals, but clearly the national mood, right? The Trump administration's saying, our schools are failing, let's privatize them, let's give your tax dollars to churches to educate your kids, let's give your tax dollars to for-profit corporations. This has a ripple effect because the one thing they message over and over again is failure, despite record high grad rates, college participation rates. And look at the economy we have built with the American public education system. It's a pillar of our democracy. So yeah, I'm relentless about this conversation right now that if you want your levies to pass locally, support them, and then have a different conversation around what the state ought to do. But I think this year we saw either the Chronicle out of Centralia or the Columbian, somebody reported that the state Republican Party spent donor money, not supporting candidates in the area, but in the battleground school district, they spent party money to oppose a school levy to help kids. Like that is mega stuff we have never seen before in the state. So yeah, I'm damn frustrated by that because we can have really different opinions on how to go forward, but as Democrats and Republicans and nonpartisans for 100 years, 130 years in this state, we supported levies, especially when they're only 17% of the average school budget.
What are the enrollment trends right now? I know they were down for a while. Is there any
Yeah.
sign of bounce back?
We've been up for 3 years in a row, so our down point was 3 years ago. Kind of the depths of COVID was the worst of it. They won't recover totally, though, because we just have a birth rate that is much smaller.
And what about, I mean, this term school choice is back in vogue, especially in red states. I mean, the Texas legislature has just passed a hard-fought, years-long fought effort to allow for public dollars to go to private schools. I mean, you go to Washington, D.C., there's charter schools all over the city. What is it about this state, and why are you so adamantly opposed to more what some families and what proponents would call school choice? I know opponents say it's stealing money from public schools and giving it to private schools, but why not allow more flexibility, especially because we're going to be talking about the current standards or current results in terms of student performance and the declines we're seeing?
Well, break down all the words. So choice is good. Choice for our state, I think within the public sector, accountable school boards is, pathway schools and specialty schools and the ability to pick your high school, which we have all over the state. Your kids being able to go to a college or do AP or running start. Like, we have incredible options within schools, and we need to do more of that. But they're all, in my mind, best presented when there's a locally elected school board accountable to voters, not a private board, public or private. The next word you used is sort of charters. That's very different than vouchers. So I have concerns with our charter system in the way it's governed, because an out-of-state organization, a nonprofit corporation, can come in here and just start a charter school. They don't have to talk to the local district. They don't have to reconcile it. I have real problems with that. And the state U.S. Supreme Court may be challenging some of that. That's very different, though, than vouchers, because at least our charter law makes accountability central to what they do as best they can. So that is a very different conversation than giving people money and saying, go do what you want with it. The analogy I always give is like, I pay money like you do in your taxes to support parks, right? And I don't necessarily use them, but I don't want a entertainment voucher so I can go to Disneyland. We all spend $4,000 a year on average in our taxes to support our national defense. Can you imagine a defense voucher where we said, hey, U.S. military may or may not get our money, but let's give people $4,000 for their own home security, and they can decide. Like, there are essential public services that should stay in the public sector, and schools is number one in the state.
And yet this movement is making huge inroads, again, in red states right now. You go to Arizona, you have vouchers as an option, soon to be in Texas.
One of the worst performing states in America, yes. So we'll talk about the outcomes as the research continues to come in. What we know is it unfortunately brings us back to pre-Brown versus Board of Education. It's resegregating schools. I take my money, and if I am white and I am Christian, I go to one school. If I'm African American and I'm, a Baptist versus Protestant in the South, I take my money to my religious school. We are resegregating schools in the South. So even if they show me good results, which they don't have yet, I will never buy into the idea that we should be anything but common in terms of our community-based, neighborhood-based schools with choice within that public sector system. So that's just a difference of where we are, and we'll see how it plays out. But
well, it's a nice segue to academic performance. You got beat up by the Seattle Times editorial board when you were running for re-election, both in the primary and in the general. The Seattle Times editorial board said that that student outcomes are lackluster, and noted that Washington ranks 35th in high school graduation rates, 40th in college readiness, said it's not just a hangover from the pandemic. We continue to see test scores come in. Math and reading scores declined over a decade, with 8th grade math proficiency dropping sharply. The NAAP scores have not been strong and are getting weaker. What is going on here? And to what extent is Chris Reykdal responsible for this, since you are a 3-term state school superintendent, despite the fact that the Seattle Times might have been working against you there?
Yeah, they have been forever. I appreciate them mostly. First
they
of
did
all,
endorse you, by the way, in the general, but not in the primary. I'm just, to be clear.
It doesn't matter. I want whole context for every story. That's why I have high expectations of that editorial board and all the others. So this narrative of failing schools or declining scores, it all has to have context.
I saw a headline that Mississippi's beating us on some front right now.
They are not. So this is the part I spend all of my energy, because I need people to sort of objectively look at this stuff, right, instead of just read headlines. We are above the national average in 4th grade and 8th grade. It's the only grades in which we have a national test, 4th and 8th grade math and reading. The relative
My
performance.
8th grader, I think, is taking it right now.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Yeah, right now. Federally mandated, by the way. Federally mandated, interestingly, which I don't think the Fed should be mandating tests, but they
She was
do.
pointing out she gets to do it on her birthday.
Oh,
so
that's
she was
nice.
really,
That's
yeah.
nice. Well,
But I
best
know
of
it's not
luck.
your fault.
Best of luck. So big picture, right? Reading scores across the globe are down for 15 straight years, across the planet Earth. So we know there are big things happening in reading, and I think it's a couple things. Number one, cellular devices and social media have changed kids. It's hardwired them differently. The time is the biggest issue. In America now, the average kid spends as much time on social media during Monday through Friday as they do in formal instruction. So there's also good things about social media. It's not a total criticism, but we're never going to be back to where we were when the habits of kids was go to school, play until it got dark, and then do homework and read. That's not the reality today with social media. So if you zoom out, all of a sudden we have a reading problem around the world, or do we? This is the other thing I keep saying. We're supposed to assess effective communication, and for hundreds of years it's been around reading formal prose and preparing for college. Kids are really good communicators, but they might be using a shorthand that in 10 years or 20 years is going to be totally normal to us, but today they look out of bounds. They're producing video. They're doing a lot in audio these days. They are communicating in unprecedented ways. They're just not reading the same way. And we have two generations who say, but that's the only way we knew to measure success. So honestly, the jury's still out on whether or not this is going to produce a better society, a better economy, probably a better economy. These kids will be more prepared for jobs than we were. But it's not going to produce better readers of formal prose and maybe not better writers. It's concerning. I generally share that. But we maintain above the national average in those 4th and 8th grade assessments. We just had improvement in 4th grade math. NAEP does not compare the states and rank them. It says, how many states are outperforming you? And in both measures, one of them, there's only 14 states outperforming us, and the other one, there's only 3 or 4 states statistically outperforming us. So those are the facts. Now, if the raw scores go down another couple points, we can say, yep, scores are still going down, but relative performance matters a ton. And then the last thing I'm always going to say to folks is, show me a university who uses any of them. If they're so important, show me a university who uses any of these formal exams that are now required of kids that for the first 200 years of American history were never required.
So let me just go back to what the Seattle Times said. 35% of low-income kids in Washington are reading at grade level. 35% of low-income kids. Even
Wrong.
fewer can handle math. Those results would be unacceptable anywhere but in a state where the economy is powered by science and technology and where 47% of students qualify as low income. The implications are ominous.
This is why I want the facts. This is why we've sat down with them, and I'm not criticizing them. Everyone has this belief, but for too long, people have looked at our 1, 2, 3, 4-point scale and said if you're a 3 or a 4, you're at grade level and passing, and if you're a 1 or 2, you're failing. That is fundamentally false, and we keep trying to say to folks, here's the proof. 54% of kids who get a 2, which most of the media says is failing because they don't understand psychometrics, 54% of kids who get a 2 go to college in their first year. So there's a mismatch on this line we drew in the standardized test that's allowing people to say, half our kids can't read. No, 3/4 of them read at grade level or higher. That still means we've got a quarter who need help. But you've got to scale what it means to be grade level versus university proficient. And we give a 10th grade test in our state, and half the kids are ready for college level reading and math by 10th grade. But we keep saying if you're not that, you're failing. That's just a misinterpretation of the way it works. And that's not me saying it, that's the National Testing Consortium.
Another narrative is that we're plowing more and more money into education and getting worse and worse results, or not getting the results, the kind of comparable results that should be gotten. The Manhattan Institute report card, annual report card, says the No Child Left Behind era saw gains, particularly amongst disadvantaged students. Those gains reversed under Common Core, further eroded after the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015, and sort of lay out this narrative of declining performance over time. And then in a state like Washington, where we've ramped up spending, notwithstanding the conversation we've just had about kind of where we're at right now. But again, how do you respond to that?
Big context, right? Common Core comes in, it's controversial, it's actually decent standards. Most of the states, ours included, had some improvement. It came just a couple years before the onslaught of social media and the total decline of global scores. And so, you know, what I'm going to tell you is put it in context. The purpose of an education system is to prepare kids for the next step. I think the fact that college remediation rates continue to decline, says that we're doing a pretty damn good job here in the state, but there are definitely some students who struggle. But again, you got to look at the larger context and understand that the school system we went to is very different than the one that kids are going to today. So I want to keep preparing kids for what they need, not what we thought was the gold standard, which candidly was getting every kid university prep ready. I want them all to have that chance. But for the student who does not want a literature course their senior year because they know they want to go run heavy equipment for $100,000 a year, I want that kid to load up on all the career and tech ed courses they want. And if there are people who say, but that student didn't get a high enough score in literature or literacy, that's been our economy for 240 years. It's only recently that we've quantified that and told a bunch of kids that they're failures. But the performance isn't any different. In fact, it's probably better because we see more kids take math, science, and English all the way through their senior year than any time in our history. So they're taking the rigorous coursework at levels we've never seen before, but we've introduced this test in the last 2 decades, and we drew a line and said everyone who doesn't get to that line is a failure. I think it's damaging, and there's a better system.
So would you ditch the tests?
I would ditch the test in a heartbeat, the federally mandated test, but we're still going to need assessment. Yeah. So there's a way to do that by saving millions of dollars by sampling kids, so we get student groups assessed, we understand districts and geographies that aren't performing well. But there's a way to save money. We spend $1.5 billion in this country every year on a standardized test that tells us that kids in poverty struggle more than kids who have a lot of wealth. How many more years are we going to do that?
What's your thinking? There's a movement sweeping the country to ban cell phones and smartwatches from classrooms and even schools throughout the bell-to-bell bans. We didn't pass a law here, but many other states have, Democrats, Republicans.
Yeah, so a year ago I put out guidance to school systems saying with or without a law, the expectation is that you're going to adopt new policies on phones. And most of the districts now have new policy, and the vast bulk of them are banning phones in the classroom. It's a terrible word to say ban because some teachers use it as an instructional tool, but it's now up to the teacher. Where they've implemented it with fidelity, it's going really well, and students tell us that. I mean, it's not just teachers. Students say this is so much better.
Do you think we need a state law?
Eventually, so we always try the honey first, and we've got 70 or 80% of districts. We just surveyed them who are like, yep, we've got a new policy. It's going well. There's always that last quarter of districts who don't want to do it. And eventually, we'll see if that performance is so real that we need a state law. Generally, you avoid mandates if you can avoid them.
Do you still think AI is going to revolutionize how students learn and how teachers teach?
Already is. Already is, which is another reason why this test thing is going to have to come into better focus. If you want your kids to learn concepts and have critical thinking, but they can go use a tool in 2 seconds to write the 5-page paper, you better stop expecting the paper to be written by the kid. And that sounds really harsh, but there's ways to get critical thinking, which is what prompts did you use? Tell me about your inquiry. And then once you got the paper, now I want you to edit it. Now I want you to rewrite that thing. Teaching changes with AI because it makes you actually focus on the hard skills that you want kids to learn.
Do you still think it's
going to
allow
homework.
Do you think it's still going to allow students to sort of work at their own pace, and then teachers sort of swoop in and be more individualized and mentor based?
Eventually, I mean that sounds so nice right now, but when you've got a 3rd grade classroom of 30 kids and they're all in different places,
but you said that you
easy.
envision that future. Last time we spoke or the time before, do you still sort of see?
Yeah.
I think that's where the hockey puck is going.
We see the software already developing that has kids evaluated real time while they're reading so that there isn't some formal test, but they're giving them constant feedback. Customization.
There are going to be some parents, I might be among them, who are going to have a really hard time with the idea that it would be okay for AI to write the 5-page paper.
Well, we're not going to stop them, so don't make the 5-page paper what you grade kids on. Figure out another way to figure out if they actually understand what it produced, and can they edit it, can they change it, can they see perspective.
Just lastly, are you still trying to put yourself out of a job? Do you think OSPI should not be an elected position?
We should have this conversation because there's 6 or 7 agencies trying to run K-12 in the state, and there needs to be one. I've said very clearly OSPI should staff these organizations if they want to keep the boards because you get good perspective, but we're overpaying 6 or 7 executives. I'm not shy about that. If it's in our office, great, we're in the Constitution, but if that kind of concentration makes people nervous and they want it under the governor, then that's a perfectly acceptable model too that a third of the states use. What I've tried to say is take me out of the equation, Chris the person in my office. If you look at good governance right now, you would never design the system that we have today. And my office is about ready to take massive cuts that the legislature just levied. Most agencies are. Without without a single examination of the overlapping governance in the state. I thought that was a missed opportunity, so I'm going to keep challenging lawmakers. Focus on government efficiency first, and then decide where you want this office. We should keep an open mind to all of it.
Would we always have a superintendent of public instruction? Just might be appointed?
Yeah, that's how it works in about 3/4 of the states. Either a board or a governor appoints, and about a third to a quarter of the states it's elected.
Okay, going to stop you there. State School Superintendent Chris Reykdal. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We will see you again next week.